Last time around, we were talking about birth rates, and this time we're going to talk about life expectancy. So 100 years ago, people didn't really live very long. In India and South Korea, your life expectancy 100 years ago was only 23. And even globally, it wasn't particularly long. That was largely due to high child mortality. 50% of children didn't make it past age 10. There was lots of infectious disease around. Poor sanitation, all kinds of other problems. And things have gotten a lot better. We have better health care. Sanitation has improved. We've eliminated a lot of infectious disease. We have much better science. We have higher GDP levels globally. All of those things have contributed to us living longer. But we now experience high inequality in terms of life expectancy, both between countries and within countries. So industrialization has really helped with life expectancy, and most countries are catching up to some degree. Global life expectancy is now about 70. But there's a huge range. So the lowest country is the Central African Republic. Their life expectancy is 53. And Japan has the highest life expectancy of 85. But as I said, countries are catching up. What is kind of interesting to me, though, is that within a country, countries that have high income inequality, like Brazil has high income inequality, South Africa has high income inequality, the US and China have moderately high income inequality. But if you have a high Gini coefficient, which is what we use to measure income inequality, you also have high life expectancy inequality. So higher percentages of the population being over 65, that is how we define an aging world. That percentage has doubled, or the number of people in that over 65 category has doubled since 1980, and it's going to double again by 2050. By the year 2030, people over 65 will outnumber people under 10 for the first time ever. So why is this happening? Well, if we combine our two last topics, we can figure out why this topic is happening. First off, we've had a big decline in fertility. Women just aren't having as many babies. We've also had improvements in survival, so people who are alive are living longer. Population aging has some real economic impacts that I want you to think about. So there's something called the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is the ratio of people who are young and earning money and paying into our tax and economic system compared to as a percentage of the people they are supporting, or the people who are being supported by our system. So, for example, taxpayers are paying into Social Security, and retired people are taking money out of Social Security. That is our dependency ratio. So our dependency ratio is really going to become challenged because we won't have enough younger people paying into the system, supporting the number of old people who are taking money out of the system. There will be increased government spending, and so that has the potential to place a higher tax burden on the people left working. So those who are left working are going to have to pay more taxes to support those who are no longer working. We also have some really dramatically changing consumption patterns. Older people don't buy as much. They are saving their money. They already have a house. They already have stuff. They want to downsize. They don't want to buy more stuff. People spend the most money when they are forming households, not when they are getting rid of their households. So to deal with our aging populations, we have to have new economic policies built around things like housing employment, healthcare, social safety nets, etc. Because one of the unfortunate downsides that is already occurring, and this is just going to keep getting worse, is that the aging are increasingly poor. And so the aging are faced with rising housing costs, rising healthcare costs, and very low interest. So poverty has been increasing. I think it's really interesting to note that pensioner poverty is worse in South Korea. And there are some interesting reasons for that. One is that many elderly people in South Korea live alone. They're not well supported by their families, which is sort of contrary to what we think of typically as kind of an Asian collectivist culture of taking care of your own family. But what really happened in South Korea was that the life expectancy growth was very, very fast. South Korea didn't have a long life expectancy until just recently. So historically, they don't have a whole lot of savings, and they don't have a big social safety net accumulated for their pensioners. There was a focus on spending on Korean children to sort of encourage education and to promote their children's lives, but that has really hurt the savings of many elderly. Okay, so what can be done about these population pyramids that are starting to cause some trouble? Well, Germany a couple of years ago let in a whole lot of Syrian refugees. Well, they didn't just do that because they're nice. I think they let in 1 million, which relative to their population is quite high as a percentage. They didn't do that because they're nice. They did that because they need younger people. They need young people to balance out all the aging people in their population. Migrants tend to be younger. Migrants tend to have high fertility rates. Migrants tend to be consumers. Migrants are forming households. Migrants have big families, they work hard, they're entrepreneurial, they can drive your economy. So if you want to balance out your messy population pyramid problems, migration is one solution. And that is one reason why Japan has struggled, is because they have been very resistant to immigration in the past. So they're now instead going toward robots. So we talked in a previous lecture about the cultural impacts of migration and how migration can promote cultural convergence, so we won't spend much more time there. But there are lots of social impacts, both positive and negative, that go along with migration. So there certainly are language problems, there are racial and ethnic discrimination problems that all come hand in hand with migration. You also end up with weaker family structure. A lot of times the person who migrates might be the working parent who's able to migrate. The husband might migrate and then he's sending money back to his wife and family. So you have children losing parental care. You have migrants moving into places where there are not safety nets for migrants. There are not families there to support migrants. Migrants end up in lower social positions. They may end up with psychological impacts of that. But again, there's this issue that migration fixes social challenges caused by aging populations. So on the economic impact side, this creates a lot of debate and a lot of political debate. We're just going to touch on it lightly here. But you have cheap labor. That helps keep consumer prices down. You also have people who are overcoming labor shortages. We saw that in one of our readings for this week. In the UK, people come to pick berries from others. Plus, as I mentioned, under social impacts, you have all this family formation, you have lots of consumption, and in terms of jobs, migration is generally a net contributor of jobs. While there's this impression that migrants steal jobs and that kind of thing, really there is very little empirical support for that. So you need to kind of get that out of your head and think of the issue more from a more complex perspective. The job stealing issue thinks about jobs as a fixed number, like it's kind of a zero-sum game, and it's not. We know that migration can drive economic growth with that, which actually creates more jobs. There is some empirical data that supports that migration does put downward pressure on salaries, but in terms of jobs, they're not really stealing our jobs. So who's going where? So I put in this image is a little bit dated, but I think it still highlights some of the most important flows of migration. Of course, Mexico to the United States, and this is legal migration, by the way. India to the UAE, I think that's really interesting. You know, we think that our migration flow from Mexico to the US tends to be all consuming for Americans, but there are these other big migration flows around the globe that are very important. In the future, there's going to be a lot of climate-related migration. So it's going to be a huge driver of future migration trends, especially with people coming from sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. There will be something like 140 million people forced to migrate because of the climate. So here's your next lecture. Okay, we're back, and now we're going to talk about remittances. I think remittances is really interesting, and it's something that's often overlooked. Remittances is money sent home by people working abroad, and it can be a lot of money. This class has largely been about global flows, and one global flow that we shouldn't ignore is the global flow of remittances. So there are something like 258 million people living abroad, and a good majority of those are supporting people back home. Remittance flows last year, so that was in 2019, were higher than FDI flows. So there were $550 billion in remittances, and that is higher than FDI. So, you know, think about how important that is. We talked about FDI earlier in the class. Well, these remittance flows are even bigger than that. India is one of the largest receivers of flows. As you can see by this particular chart, the United States is funding remittance flows in many other places. Now, the UAE is also doing its share of funding. A lot of India's GDP is coming from the UAE. So what's interesting about remittances? Well, first up, remittances represent an economic leakage for the host country. So to understand the concept of an economic leakage, you have to first understand the idea of the circular flow of income and expenses within an economy. So my spending at a restaurant is that restaurant's income. Then their expense of paying their employee is that employee's income. That employee then goes and buys groceries, and that employee's expense is income to the grocery store. So that is how basically money gets refunneled in what's called a multiplier effect within an economy. And so that's a good thing. That's how we want our economy to be. Well, a leakage causes money to exit that circular flow. So if you think about it, a remittance is money that is paid to an employee who, instead of spending that money here in the United States, they send that money to Mexico or to China or to India or wherever. And so that money becomes income and starts to circulate in that other economy, but not in our economy. So while remittances are good for global economic growth, they are detrimental potentially to the country that is paying the salary of the migrant who's then sending away the money. Now, luckily, migrants don't send away all their money, and they spend plenty of money within the United States, which is why they lead to economic growth. But there is this economic leakage issue. For some countries, remittances are a major source of GDP. So, for example, remittances are 3% of India's GDP, and India has a big economy, has a huge population and big economy, so that's a lot of money. For other countries, it's even more important. The Philippines gets 10% of its GDP from remittances. So one problem with remittances is that there are high transaction costs. So we've talked about friction in terms of when we were talking about currency, and fees associated with remittances are a high source of friction. So as much as 3 to 5% cost on a remittance is very typical, and in some African countries it can cost as much as 10% of the remittance can be charged in fees to get the money back to Africa. So that is a huge problem. There are also lots of human rights violations that occur in terms of remittances. For example, in the Gulf countries like the UAE, there's some evidence that last year 117 Indian workers died in abusive conditions for every $1 billion that was sent home to India. And that information was on the World Economic Forum. Okay, so we've made it to the end of our lecture on demographics.